My notes for tonight are called Notes for an African World Revolution. I'm going to do a lot of dreaming and point to a lot of dreamers, because if ever you're going to make anything so, you have to believe that it can be so. And we have suspended too much of our belief in the possibility that we can do things. And the main thing taken away from us is the concept of nation structure, nation formation, and nation building. Another thing that has been taken away from us is the ability to examine our adversaries and to move among them and still advance by knowing something of their technique. We have been rather naive in the meeting of people, and we have overlooked too many items in relationship to our own freedom, and we have not developed a technique of dealing with our own traders in cop-outs. If we couldn't do anything else, we could at least isolate them. Why is a Roy Ennis running loose? Why is he so free? Why is he walking among us and we won't even scratch him, let alone hit him? Now, years ago, when he advocated that blacks should join UNITA in South Africa against Angola, I was the first person to take a public stand against it and to say that by no means should one African ever lift arms against another African. And yet, except for a brief article in the Amsterdam News and his inept reply, that was just about the end of it. And yet we have not looked at Angola as we need to look at it. We haven't even looked at the present visit of Savimbi. Why is it that Savimbi is having some success? He's passing himself off as a black nationalist, and he's getting away with it. Why is he getting away with it in Angola? When are we going to face up to the truth about what happened in Angola? He would not be able to get away with it had the alleged political left group in Angola did a good job of communicating with the people. But who came to power in Angola? Not Angolans at all. Bunch of assimilados. Europeanized blacks, over half of them in the government, have Portuguese white wives. Most of them are Catholics. Most of them have never worn native dress in their entire life. How are you going to communicate with the people when you live a life alien to their culture? All right, now, this is not a main item. Savimbi is not a main item on the agenda, but you have to study the Savimbis of the world and the Roy Ennises of the world and see how they, in the Bear Rustins of the world when he was around to be studied. And we have to concede that some people have made their separate peace, and they're not a part of us anymore. All right, now, because we miss so many vital items that relate to us, and 20 years later, we wish we had dealt with it initially. I'm going to pick up an item and deal with it before getting into the lecture, because this item relates to the kind of revolution that we need among ourselves. And we need to do what all people do. Who is, ask the question, who is loyal to this house? Too many people walk among us, live among us, that declare no loyalty to us, eat our bread and sleep in our bed. No one is asked, are you loyal to the cause of our liberation? Now, the American census is trying out something that can be disaster for us. They're going to have a new classification on the census. You can mix, if you mix, you can put down mixed. Now you got a whole lot of retreating blacks looking for the Dutch uncle, the Irish grandfather. You have a whole lot of blacks with Indian blood in them, relation to the Seminoles, relate to everything except Africa. And these mixes can be used as a buffer. Then a lot of us will overlook something which we need to know about our history in this country, about the role of certain mixed people in our history who were blacker than the blacks in their actions. Now, before we deal with mixes, let's ask the question, who mixed them? Inasmuch as they arrived here all black, and they had no names. The slave ships didn't bring any West Indians, East Indians, Black Americans, didn't bring any AKAs, didn't bring any Deltas, didn't bring any high yellows or low yellows. Who now, the person who mixed them, now going to put the mixes against the so-called unmixers. And where will that put most of us? Most of us have every gradation under the sun right within our own family. And a cousin who is mixed is just as much of a cousin who one is not mixed. What these people are understanding, they're understanding something at last that Karl Marx did not understand. While European life is based basically on economics and class, non-Western life is based basically on religion and culture. And if they can split us along these lines, they put one against the other. Now in South Africa, the colors discovered something. They discovered that they were being used. And when the apartheid government took them off the voting roll, took them off the housing consideration roll, they got the point. Now they prefer to be called black, and they live in the black neighborhood and don't distinguish themselves from other blacks because they suffer the same way. Now, the American census that intends to mix, tend to create the classification of mixture, are not prepared to accept the mixtures into their social order. You will see the mixers doing that work, but you will not see the mixers in their living room or at their dining room table. They begin to discover that once you put all the purely African people together, including the African people of Asia, 100 million people called untouchables. Once you put all of that together, you've got a formidable force in the world speaking. And the one reason which keeps them from greatness is that they have not been able to unify their culture and make a connection with Africa. When you look at the African people in the Pacific, some mixed with Polynesians, but some not mixed at all. You see them in India, some mixed with East Indians and some not mixed at all. If you classify all the mixed people of the world, that might be a major portion of the population of the world. Now they're beginning to use this against us, and now we have to figure out what are we going to do when they come. See, it asks for this kind of classification. A lot of us gonna fall for it without knowing that it is a trap. Part of our total revolution in the world is to revolt against other people's classification of us. We have been named, we must be namers. We have to decide the name in the category. Then we have to look at our history in this country and in Africa itself. What did the mixed do in Ghana? These mixed sons of German missionaries, the Rheindoffs and the like. In Ghana, and this is a case where serious study along the coast among the Fante people, where you found a lot of these mixtures in public life, not a single mixed person ever turned on Africa in favor of his father's people. And out of these mixtures came some of the finest politicians that Ghana and Africa in general got to know. People like Casler Hayford, Horton Mills, the Kwesi Brews. These people laid the foundation for modern political Ghana. These committed mixed people. Now, are we going to ignore all of that? Can we deal with the fact that Gordon in Jamaica was a mixture? And he's one of the national heroes. And he was one that began to call attention to the fact that slavery had been, the emancipation of slavery had been a sham. It was a sham everywhere. So there's no point of telling me that my slavery, my emancipation came 30 years from yours. That means your sham came 30 years before my sham. Slavery still is going on. Slavery has not been abolished. It's been transformed. All right, now let's look at this country and let's look at some mixtures that we need to take into consideration. Frederick Douglass was mixed. Are we going to give him up? Bishop Turner was mixed. Frederick Douglass, maybe the finest leader to come out of the 19th century. Bishop Turner, the forerunner of the radical ministry, starting in the 19th and not dying until the early part of the 20th. Are we going to stop going to Tuskegee because Booker T. Washington was mixed? Look kind of trap we're going to get ourselves in. Now, when we look at the public servants, what would we have done without an Adam Powell? Arrogant, big mouth. He could pass for white any place, and yet he lived blackness smeared in people's faces and built a political career on it. When you look at Walter White of the NAACP, smug, arrogant, blue-eyed blonde, but always acted as though he was doing us a favor because he passed for black. Let's look at the good and the bad. Let's look at the mixed cop-outs. Then we should look at some black cop-outs too, because color really wasn't the main factor. It was commitment and understanding of the nature of our cause. Now, what are we actually going to do when the census taker come and said that, are you mixed? You suffered as a black person. You lived as a black person. And American law said one drop of us makes you a whole of us. Are we ready to deal with the stupid racial laws of the United States? I thought I'd call this to your attention because it's trouble still to come. And the nature of this trouble sometimes is the inability to stay in struggle. I went out to Milwaukee some years ago and set up a Black Studies program. It was going pretty well. 3 years later, I went back. Most of the black fellas had white girls, and some of the black girls had white men. And I turned to one of the girls who was very active in all of this. And I asked, what happened? And she said, the brothers left us alone. After all, we are human. Then she turned to this white man and said that, to tell you the truth, because she was married to him. To tell you the truth, I don't love him. I don't even like him. Then I said, why? Why the marriage? Why the relationship? She said, Professor Clarke, the struggle is so lonely. And people need people. I think we've missed taking care of some vital things in our struggle. We failed to do some housekeeping. She should not have been so lonely that she would marry a man she not only didn't love, didn't even like. Then we should produce a caliber of young people who can take the loneliness of struggle. A lot of people's struggle has been lonely. And a lot of people do what they do out of choice. I have said repeatedly, I've met a number of rich men in my life, and I never met one who had a better mind than me. All right, there. So if it was my choice to be rich, I think I could have made it. I have the mentality to bring it off. And yet I do not regret having walked down this course of action. I haven't regretted the nature of the commitment, for it has made me total as a human being. It has locked me into struggle in such a way that struggle becomes a way of life, becomes a birthright. And you leave as best you can your stamp in a partial message on a generation through your truthful participation in struggle. All right, now, these are some preface notes. I got to get to work now. I have come to talk about notes for an African world revolution. Take complete changes. So I'm going to dream a little bit and hope a little bit and let you know that if a people can bring off, I have the will to bring off any monumental scheme, they've got to dream it. Then they've got to make it so. I'll start with the making of a spiritual revolution. Most of us, one way or the other, someplace or the other, associate with some form of religion and some form of church. I am not asking anyone to leave anything. I'm saying that everything that touches your life should be an instrument of liberation. And that making your spirituality an instrument of liberation does not make you one mite less religious, but more so. And I'm saying that we might have to step back in order to step forward. We might have to ask some questions. What kind of religion did we have before Judaism, Christianity, and Islam? How did we determine right and wrong before these religions? These religions, all made from elements of our own spirituality, dressed up, garnished, and brought back to us and sold to us as something original, when there's nothing original in any three of them. How do we get back and how do we transform what we've got into an instrument of liberation? And how do we understand that you can be religious without being spiritual, and you can be spiritual without belonging to any religion? Because the spiritual came first, before the formation of the religion itself. And the religion came out of the spirituality that was there before. How do we go back and pick up and utilize some of these values? Values of self-love, self-appreciation, appreciation for the family, a concept of unity and a concept of distribution of goods and service that was purely socialist before Europe. How do we go back to ourselves and find the mechanism of our own salvation? Maybe we need to look at other people and how they take systems from the outside and transform them into something they need inside. The Chinese tried Stalin's concept of communism, Marx and Engels' concept of communism. It didn't fit their soul. It didn't fit their cultural being. Did they become less communist? No. They Chinesized their communism to the point where they altered it and made it fit the Chinese psyche and the Chinese soul. In this revolt, in the establishment of a new spirituality of liberation, can we make these alterations without people assuming that we're trying to destroy the faith, when in actuality we are strengthening the faith and building the faith? We have never said or agreed that religion was the opiate of the people. that can come from nobody but a European, because he's made it the opiate. Now, religion or spirituality, which is the more correct phraseology, spirituality was part of the totality of our life. It wasn't a Sunday thing. It was a total thing. And it determined so much of our life. How can we have a revolt, a spiritual revolt, without people assuming that we're trying to destroy the church, when in actuality we're trying to strengthen the church? Trying to give it a new mission and a new destiny and a new will. I do not think we study enough about how other people reacted to forms of oppression. I don't think we study enough on the rise of modern Japan. I do not mean that we need to imitate Japan. I personally think the Japanese capitalists are going to ultimately back themselves into a corner when they're not going to be nothing but brown-skinned or yellow-skinned Europeans if they don't halt at a given point. But what gave them the ability to rise and to organize are things that they still have. They still have a basic religion of their own design and choice. They still have national commitment, one to the other. They still have the fervor of a Japanese nationalism, a love of nation and self that cuts down on the friction between Japanese and Japanese. They believe in themselves as thinkers. Now you see the recent news item, some 24-year-old trainee on Wall Street learns enough information to feed it to someone else where they would engage in a $19,000 stock swindle. $19 million stock swindle. Do you know we've got 24-year-old people who don't think that they have the ability to handle $1,000? The structure of one man's brain is not radically different from another. These young people really peeped the system and made it work in their favor. And if they can peep the system and make it work in their favor, there's something radically wrong with the system itself. Because I am so uncapitalist, and because I know as a teacher that the modern capitalist world rolls on slavery and exploitation of all people, black and white, I have no vested interest in its survival. If it goes, it goes. And yet, I know that you cannot live in a capitalist society with any degree of safety and comfort without having capital. Now, it seems that I'm engaged in a contradiction. If I believe in socialism, and I do, why do I believe just as much in black ownership of black communities? Which seems to you is communism, it's capitalism. But to me, black ownership of black community places in the hands of black people the economic means to affect social change in their favor. Build a private school if you don't like the public school. Use your politics to bring more pressure on the public schools. And always look back in order to look forward. How did African people rule states before this encroachment? They're as African as you, that if they did this, they had something you failed to have, and that is self-confidence. Self-confidence based on an understanding of both your culture and your religion, and your understanding that culture, religion, and your politics are all one and the same. And all of these things have to come together to advance you in total. And this is practically all the Japanese did. Now, remember, 200 years ago, they didn't even have a good wheelbarrow. And look at them now. They committed themselves to mastering Western technique. But in mastering Western technique, they did not make the mistake you made over integration. They mastered Western technique and held on to their basic culture and their basic religion and their basic customs and way of life. And they altered them to suit themselves. But you thought that by being integrated, you had to put down your customs and your religion, even stop eating cornbread. And some of you did. Some of you love watermelon. Eat watermelon, no more. Live in pain without watermelon. Now, in looking at a spiritual revolution, we have to make our spirituality a part of the totality of our life and not a weekend matter of getting dressed up and going on Sunday. Must be a part of our total approach to life, how we treat our children, how we treat our wives, how we greet our uncles, how we deal with the evil ones, how we deal with the drunken ones. Now, if we're going to have a spiritual revolution, we're going to have a commercial revolution. Now, you want to know what's the socialist talking about, a commercial revolution? Because I know that without the mastery of the techniques of commerce, no country can function well, no matter what kind of government it's got. If we master our communities and control the basic wealth in our communities and see that the dollar turns over 8 times before it leaves the community, and sometimes make sure it don't even leave at all. Every time we have a shoe repaired, we go to another brother to get the shoe repaired, and another brother fixing the car. All we do is a built-in economic system in our own community based on confidence in ourselves and based on making sure that the techniques, the skills, the basic crafts in the community are forever sharp. You got to do a good job if you want to keep the job. Now, let's look back and see when we had all these skills and were running nations and running them well and wasn't asking for any outsiders to educate our children. How we lost it and how we'll have to regain it, because our next assignment in history, no matter how you look at it, no matter if you try to avoid it, our next assignment in history is nation management and nation structure. And no matter how you try to avoid doing so, we have to look again at Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Elijah Muhammad. These men all saying the same things, using different vantage points, different words, different organizational structure. Because people rise and fall within the context of the nation institution. And when they lose the ability to master and control the nation institution, they lose their freedom. This is why we are a nation within a nation searching for a nationality. This is why we can say American and don't add African to it. No German would ever say American without adding Germany to it. Prefacing it by, I'm a German, was born in America. All right, now, what did we do when we had states of our own? Let's look at the last cluster of states. For the moment, I am not dealing with the first great states, the Nile Valley states. Let's deal with those other rivers for a little while. And the great states on these other rivers, the Niger River states, Ghana, Mali, Sangay, the handling of the gold trade by Ghana, literally controlling the cross-Saharan trade in gold, creating a monarchy so democratic that it was the role model for the democratic monarchies of the world. And see what happened when Africans went into Spain with the Berbers and the Arabs. Spain, a sleepy, poorly administered country then and now, was put on its feet, given a university, sidewalks with lights, a financial institution controlled mainly by the grandees of the Spanish Jews. This would last for 800 years, Africans administering a country away from home. In the meantime, at home, it would be 1,000 years or over 1,000 years of great structures of states in inner West Africa. Ghana being the best known but not the first, assumed to be the first. But the state Mali, with its great emperors, Mansa Musa, Sekuru, Sundiata, the boy who started it all. Then finally, the emergence of the greatest of all the African states, larger than the continental limits of the United States, Sangay, its university at Sankore, its great scholars, its finest rulers, Soni Ali and Muhammad Ababiko Ituri. Can we look back at examples of African magnificence in the ruling of the state? And can we look at the records of what other people said about them when foreigners came into these countries? What did they say about what did they see? They would call the last of these great rulers the greatest civil administrator of all times. If you can produce, concurrent with slavery, a ruler who was called the greatest civil administrator of all times, why is it we have so little knowledge of him now? Why do we pull so little on the greatness that we have been in order to understand the greatness we still have to be. We made such poor use of our history and our heroes. Muhammad Abubakar Ituri, he was the greatest ruler of state of his time. Barring none. But then look, what were the other rulers of state at this time? The emperors of China, Europe getting off of its feet after the Dark Ages. There were many great rulers. Why is it this African was called the greatest of them all, barring none, having examined all of them? And why can't we today look at his life and look at his rule and look at his state and begin again the whole concept of state formation? I don't mean that someone else came to collect his taxes. He did it himself. No one else came to develop his army. He developed it himself. No one else developed his marketplaces. He did it himself and revolutionized the whole concept of weights and measures. What I'm trying to say now is that we must pull on the total good as a people, yesterday's good, in order to create today's nation structure, in order to shape the kind of people we will have to be tomorrow. And we will have to learn that the carbon copy of our master's originality is wearing out, if indeed he ever had any originality at all. We have to study yesterday in order to create today. Now, these states existed concurrent with the beginning of the slave trade. These states in inner West Africa concurrent with the slave trade in coastal West Africa. Now let's study what went wrong with our family communication. If we're going to have a whole revolution for social change, we have to look at when we had it as against when we lost it. We have to draw on the past in order to make the present and make the future. What can we learn from how we got into this trap? What can we learn about the Europeans of that day and their intentions toward us that has not radically changed in this day? The European has not changed. When the Russians and the United States meet, they're not talking about liberation. They're not talking about liberating anybody. Which one of them will control what part of the world and stay out of each other's way so that a conflict between them won't weaken them to the point where people can come from under their control? They are discussing power. Who will have it and who will dispense it? They do not envision the world being from under the domination of Europe. Now, if you are going to take the world from under that domination, then you have to envision yourself as having the ability to do so. And if you vision yourself as having the ability to do so, then you have to have some understanding of the world when it was not under the domination of Europe. And the nature of European domination, in that none of this has anything to do with the European having a superior mind, of having ability that you do not have. It had to do with he believed he could do it, and he gained enough confidence to do it. Something which you can do if you made up your mind to do it. Now, as a result of this rise, a revolution started in the world, a revolution that we must now revolt against. And to revolt against it, you must understand how it started. How then did we lose our Africanness, and what will we have to do to regain it? How did we lose the concept of nationness and develop a concept of dependency? And what was Booker T. Washington talking about at Tuskegee with his education program? To free yourself from dependency, dependent on other people for your bread, dependent on other people for your shoes, depending on other people for your education, which is the most dangerous of all dependency, because powerful people never train powerless people in how to take their power away from them. So we're dealing with a contradiction in terms. It's a contradiction in terms to go into these schools and expect education. You get a form of indoctrination. You get certain basic curricula that you can use to educate yourself. So therefore, with us, most of the education have to happen in the homes, in the community, and in the church. You think the church is less a spiritual institution when it is engaging in education? It is not. It is more a spiritual institution. And there are many ways of praying, and there are many ways of serving whatsoever deity that you happen to choose. Now, what I'm looking at now is how we got into the trap, so I can see if I can at least estimate how we're going to have to get out of it. The major laws in the 15th and the 16th century was the concept of nation. The attaching of Africans on to other nations, the attaching some to England, the attaching some to France, some to the Portuguese, and then some to the worst of the element to come out of Europe, that they dumped into the United States. Europe was getting rid of its waste matter. It sent some to Australia. It sent some to the Pacific. We have to look again at what happened to the Africans in the Pacific. What happened to the Africans at Tasmania? Here's where an entire island was destroyed. The British sent a lot of Irish prisoners, oppressed white people, to Tasmania, to the islands near Australia. At Tasmania, where everybody was destroyed, every man, woman, and child, the British would knock a year or 5 years off of an Irish prisoner's sentence, depending on how many Tasmanians he killed. Bring 2 matching ears to the British, showing that you had killed a Tasmanian. And that's a year or 5 years off of your sentence. Now, here we see something we do not understand today, to the nature of oppressed people preying on other oppressed people in order to come from under oppression. When we use this word third world, we better use it carefully. Because there's a whole lot of people in the third world who wants black people to be second to them. And there are a whole lot of people in the third world who, in order to ingratiate themselves to the oppressor, would gladly become an honorary oppressor, for we are concerned. And some have already done it. And yet, with our goodness, our built-in hope, our beautiful humanity, our belief in justice for all people, we fall into their traps. And one of the traps we fall into is most about Hispanics. They watch and see you fight for something. And the minute you win, they come in and ask for half of it. But they weren't even in the fight. And a lot of times they get it, especially the Puerto Ricans. But even near the fight, give me half of your pie. You see, they want a parity, which means half. Because we have not learned to practice the essential selfishness of survival, I give no piece of pie until every member of my family has a piece of pie. Now, if you want to fight for a pie, then you go fight for it for your family, and I wish you well. But I fought for this for my own kith and kin, and they take priority in its distribution. Now, when we began to lose these nation lessons, we began more and more into a trap of dependency. And yet, into that same trap came the ingredients of liberation. We have not studied enough how the slaves in the Caribbean took advantage of the poor quality of the British craftsmen. How many times in places, especially like Jamaica, the British would bring over furniture from England, and this furniture made from soft wood became a dessert for termites. Just ate it up. Local craftsmen had to use that hard Jamaican wood. They had good mahogany then. They don't have it now because they overcut it and they have to wait for it to grow again, which is 20 or 40 years before they'll have good mahogany again, enough for furniture and distribution. But they had it then, had a good forest, and good mahogany. So they remade the British furniture using local wood as against the wood brought over from England. And these craftsmen not only learned to make furniture, they learned how to repair the sugar mills. They were great blacksmiths, and subsequently worked their way out of servitude and communicated with the black American freemen who had done a similar thing in New England. Now, this is where the real revolt started. This is where the whole concept of let us be a nation again, let us be a people again, let us build institutions again started. I'm saying that we need to draw some impotence on what we have already done in order to understand what we've still got to do. And I'm saying that these brothers in Jamaica and in other islands came together and began to form organizations, not based on who was from what island, but the fact that all of them, those in America and those on the islands, had the same problem. That problem was oppression. And this is why a Bayesian, Prince Hall, would come here and build the first Masonic order and not call it the Masonic order, because it wasn't about socializing drinking. It was about social uplift. It was about trying to free the slaves still not free. And he called it the African Lodge. And Peter Ogden from Antigua would take a similar approach to the Odd Fellows. Now, if we're going to revolt today, we have to look back at a time when able African people pulled themselves out of it. And we have to study how when on the eve of the Civil War, it was these rebels who forced the issue. I'm not saying that the Civil War was fought over slavery. We all know better than that. We know no white man ever fought at a war with no black people. We don't even have to argue about that. But the emotional fervor around slavery had helped to solidify the whole issue and the whole concept. African people searching to be whole again and searching to be nation again. And when after the Civil War and after the British emancipation, when they discovered it was a phony, when they discovered that having been emancipated, they had no jobs, had no housing, and they still had to go back to the same plantation to live, then another revolution and another revolutionary period would begin in the Caribbean islands. As when we discovered over here that the so-called Reconstruction had been betrayed by the Tilden-Hayes election, 1884, we knew that we had to fight for freedom all over again. And the African American, at the latter half of the 19th century, far more committed than those of the 20th century, far clearer on what he had to do, and had no illusions about freedom, because he knew that in spite of emancipation, he had no freedom. And he had no nation. Now this started a form of Pan-Africanism, migration Pan-Africanism, that we need to study. Blacks tried to migrate to Africa. Martin Delany, with the great Jamaican Robert Campbell, going to search for a place for settlement. Their respective reports still worth reading, especially Campbell's report, Pilgrimage to My Motherland. I'm saying that if we want to revolt, and we should be in constant revolt against our condition, there are examples in Europe and every place that we can use. But there are better examples among ourselves. That we did not need to leave home to get the concept of revolt or the concept of a social order different from the economic system that we lived under. And that these men in Africa, in the Caribbean islands, and in the United States were very clear on this concept. Where did we get fuzzy? At what point did we give up the original approach to revolution and began to try to integrate into the house of the oppressed? That led to the trouble that we're in right now. Early in the 20th century, African nations began to emerge, and a special study needs to be made of Ghana. early 20th century politics in Ghana and the revolt against colonialism. Case behaved for father modern Ghanaian politics. In his fight to have the exiled kings return, he converted that fight into a fight for independence. Early part of the century, after they began to exile their kings, Prempeh and Ye Asantewaa, began to build a youth movement essential to every revolution. And when near his death, 1931, he wanted to turn the mantle of responsibility over to another Ghanaian. He turned it over to one he had trained, Joseph B. Danquah. Send for JP. The mantle of responsibility now belongs to you. Under J.P. Danquah came a young student, Francis K. Nkrumah. That's the name he went by then. He began to train Nkrumah to take the mantle of responsibility. They did not, as we do today, leave things to chance. They planned them. And they came out of a society that we need to reproduce today in order to bring about our revolution. Our children should be picked out and trained for leadership from birth. Even watch how that child handles a fault. See, watch how he behaves with his sisters and brothers. Watch his ability to share with them. Watch his ability to protect them and to accept the training that will make him do it better. We should spot leaders early and begin to train them early. And there should be a priesthood of an effort. Now let's go back to how Baron Tanaka trained Japanese youth to create modern Japan. So many would go into oceanography. So many would go into the sciences. So many would go into higher mathematics. So many would go into industrial mathematics. So many would go into scientific mathematics and the chemistries. And they would roam the earth and see how other people did things. They would come home not so much to imitate them, but they would ultimately do it their way. They didn't produce things just to show that they could produce it. The Japanese had no skyscrapers up until recently. They don't have too many now. Didn't think they needed them. And didn't begin to build them until the island became so crowded they know that that's one way of saving space. After there are a number of skyscrapers, if Africans build skyscrapers to show they can build them, all right, build them. But space-wise, you don't need them. And you shouldn't build them just to imitate other people. And what I'm trying to lock into is how people maintain certain techniques that make them believe enough in themselves and become less dependent on other people in order to be whole again. And that the nature of oppression robbed us of our wholeness, a lot of our confidence. And if we are going to have a cultural revolution, this cultural revolution must first be based on regaining our confidence in our ability to handle everything in a nation. This is why I have always disagreed with the approach to South Africa. That you need to fight more than apartheid. Apartheid is a real issue. Apartheid has caused misery to a whole lot of people. You sure need to fight it all the way. But while fighting it, you need to prepare people to take over that nation. A nation needs railroads. Who's going to do it? But if you buy steel from someone else, you got to pay a high price. Who's going to develop an internal steel industry? Who's going to master the mines? Who's going to market what comes out of the mines? All of this is the restoration of self-confidence, and all of this is going back to things that you have done already at a previous time in history. And this is why, especially in New York City and New York State, you are literally kept from your history. And if you expect the present-day school system to give it to you, you are dreaming. This you have to do yourself. The Chinese didn't go out in the world and beg people to teach Chinese studies or let them teach Chinese studies. The Japanese didn't do the same thing. People don't beg other people to restore their history. They do it themselves. And they learn something about freedom that we have to learn. Freedom is something you take with your own hands. You secure it with your own hands. And if other people's hands secure it for you, other people's hands can take it away from you. But your main ally and the most dependable ally in a fight for freedom is yourself. And when we look again at Ghana in the 20s, we would understand why that nation would come into being ahead of other West African nations. Why not Nigeria? Why didn't Nigeria become independent ahead of Ghana? Ghana had something Nigeria still don't have. A homogeneous structure. People who had conflicts with themselves, but they never had conflicts that were so lasting they would fight into death. Everything was stopped short of destruction. There are no wars in Ghana parallel the Yoruba wars, Yoruba against Yoruba, or the House of Fulani wars, Muslim against Muslim. And because the wars in Ghana were short-lived, they did not build up a whole lot of bitterness one against the other. So in a political setup, they could operate one to the other. And they did something which we have not noticed and would do well to notice. They created not only politicians of substance, they created the greatest body of political literature in any African country before our sense. When you look at Mansa Saba in his work, Fantic Customary Law, how to use the laws of the Fantic people to uplift the nation. Fantic Law and Constitution. Another Ghanaian wrote and laid out a blueprint for a nation toward nationhood in West Africa. These books are not hiding from anybody. They still can be read, you know. And most of them have been reprinted. Case for Hayford, the first nationalist novel, Ethiopia Unbound. Then another little classic work, worth rereading now, because you'd understand the difference between East Africa, where the whites took the land, and West Africa, where the whites could not take the land. It's called The Truth About the West African Land Question. Then Donqua and Nkrumah's schoolmaster, looking at the religions, Akan's doctrine of God. And in his little classic work, he personally gave me one evening while scolding me at the same time, Obligations in Akan Society. And when you study Akan society and study Yoruba society, these two African cultures sustain themselves longer away from home than any other African culture that I have seriously studied. It was the Yorubas and the Akan that brought off most of the slave revolts. What I'm saying that if you are going to change anything today, you have to understand the nature of change that we have already affected, and how this nation, Ghana, created not only a political apparatus for political change and revolution, but created a literature to explain it. And that literature is still in existence. Nigeria, some literature, especially the early works of Nnamdi Ezekwe, his work on the settlement of Nigeria, is still worth reading. His book, Renaissance Africa, still worth reading. And in Southern Africa, another great body of literature, John Tingo Jabevu and Don Tingo Jabevu, father and son, Saul Platj's excellent work on the native problem in Southern Africa, Paulo Kagwa's work on the culture of Uganda, who literally stopped the wars between the Arabs, the Protestants, and the Catholics, and brought about a peace in Uganda at the turn of the century. Now, what I've been pointing to is that if there's going to be a world revolution among African people, we have to locate African people and connect with African people. And we, no matter what we call ourselves and what island we came from, or what part of Georgia or Alabama, we can still identify with these regions, but the overall identification is with Africa and with African people wherever they are on the face of this earth. We need to study how Pan-Africanism came into being in the closing years of the 19th century. We need to study H. Sylvester Williams again, and why did this Pan-African League start in Trinidad at a time when the East Indians and the Chinese were encroaching on the African population? What solidified it on those islands? And what are the early dreams of Marcus Garvey? And why did a Marcus Garvey emerge from a Jamaica other than some other places? And why did he have so little success in Jamaica and so much success outside of Jamaica? Why is it if Marcus Garvey were walking down the streets of Jamaica right now, alive, some mixed up Jamaican might stone him to death? Why did he have more success in the United States? It's not because we have different brains than others, not because we're more loyal or committed than others, but the nature of our oppression in the United States had told us very clearly, you are not wanted here. You were brought here to do labor. Now that machines made your labor obsolete, we want to get rid of you. In Jamaica, they still had the semblance of nation. They still thought they belonged to something. They belonged to an empire that was controlling the world. The sun never set on it. They assumed that they were a part of it. They still do. It is not the matter of one being more committed than the other. Different kind of master, different nature of oppression. The British have a phrase, it's not only an administration of justice, it not only must be so, it must appear to be so. But the British created an appearance that gave you the illusion of nation. When the crude white man in the United States would even give you the illusion. You even put a sign on a water fountain, black, color, white, water. Look at the utter ridiculousness of it. Water, black, color, white. So we knew we had no illusions about him. He left us with no illusions. He left us with no illusions of nation. And when Marcus Garvey came preaching nation, if we responded to it better than others, it's because we needed it more than others. And yet when you study the structure of the movement, administratively, the Garvey movement was strictly a Caribbean movement, administratively. But his followers and his supporters financially was almost solely black American. While the administrators of the movement, the clerk were basically Caribbean. And yet this caused no conflict then or now. Now, we don't have to guess about Garvey's movement now. One thing Professor Robert Hill's 8-volume history of Garvey movement has done, 5 volumes already out, he has located the documents that ends the argument. So now we can go and examine the documents. We don't have to debate as to how the movement was structured and who ran the movement. It is important that it existed because part of our future revolution, part of our move toward nationness, part of our move toward self-reliance in our community will have to be based on a serious study of this movement and to what extent it got across the concept of nationhood. Then you've got to once more look at self-reliance as advocated by the educational program of Booker T. Washington, political reliance as advocated by W.E.B. Du Bois, national and international reclamation and the redemption of Africa as advocated by Garvey. Then look at their later students, the spin-off from the movement, the heirs to the movement, the inheritors of the whole idea, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. And when you look at this in total context, you will come to a Jesse Jackson and partly see what he's doing. Someone called me today because I'm going to South Carolina to lecture tomorrow. So what do you think is the future of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition? I said it has a great future in awakening people to realize that the political mechanism is not serving them to the extent that it needs to. That it can awaken both blacks and whites to come together politically, who are not going to come together socially. And I saw this happen in San Antonio, Texas during my Army days. These were poll tax periods. And the black numbers man paid the poll tax for the blacks, and the Mexican numbers man paid the poll tax for the Mexicans. Together they had 30,000 votes in their hands before the election started. They could decide who would or would not be mayor of that town. And this went on for years until someone convinced the Mexicans. Now, my point in alluding to Jesse Jackson is that he is awakening in this country a concept that if poor whites and poor blacks have the same oppressor, if they put their political strength together, maybe both of them can knock off the oppressor. He's not asking them to marry. He's not asking them to live next door to each other. He's not even asking them to like each other. He's showing a political mechanism. But my friend who called me from South Carolina asked me about the rainbow. I said, I grew up in the South where I see rainbows almost after every rain. But have you ever seriously looked at a rainbow? Why is the black color in the rainbow? All right, you see a streak of gray, you see a blue, and sometimes a red. And yet, the symbol is good. But the blackness of the rainbow is missing. I'm talking about an actual rainbow now. I'm not talking about conversation. I'm talking about a rainbow. Because I've looked in the sky and seen enough of them to knuckle. The black is not that. And yet, I believe that Jackson, as well as King, is a part of our revolution and part of the political revolution that will lock into our cultural revolution and our spiritual revolution. That if we think that we can advance and claim those things that belong to us in this world without a drastic change that we call a revolution, then we are dreaming. And I do not mean you have to kill people, that you have to shoot at anybody, although that's a part of it, but not all of it. A revolution means social change, means a total change. In a revolution, you don't patch up old clothes, you find new clothes. And many times you don't patch up old ideas, you find completely new ideas. So we are an imaginative people, and we have survived by innovating. We're people on the stage of the world without a script. Many times we have to make up the script right in front of the audience. So I have not been talking about anything that we cannot do or have not been doing all along. I am saying that we must take a serious look at ourselves, and we must rehearse for nation by controlling our communities, by controlling the input into our education, by examining the curricula used in the school that train our children. And if it's not good, we have to either make it good or have it eliminated. By having political control over our community, and political control leads to other kinds of control. By learning some form of self-reliance, when we can employ large numbers of African people in service with other African people. If we understand the nature of our mission in the world, if we understand that Africa is a continent 12 million square miles, won't have any unemployment for the next 1,000 years. All those railroads to be built, all the steel mines to be built, the refineries to be built, the oil to be discovered. Do you think there's less oil in the body of Africa than in other places? Probably more. The connection that we have to make with African people outside of Africa, especially the large number in India and the Pacific. We need a political apparatus that will stretch around the whole world, bringing African people together. The ultimate answer is Pan-Africanism. And with Pan-Africanism, what needs to feed into Pan-Africanism is a new kind of spirituality. In total liberation, religion cannot be left out, commerce cannot be left out, culture cannot be left out, how we sing, how we walk, how we act, everything we do must be a part of a totality. And we have to learn how to relate to African people everywhere, wherever they are on the face of the earth. Africans who have one kind of product on one side of Africa need to send it to another part of Africa, or they can't use. So if you're going to do this, what you're going to have to do, stretch a railroad system across Africa. It has to be done by African engineers, African planners. If someone else does it for you, they're not only going to charge you for it, they're going to control you doing it. Part of the success of the raid at Entebbe in Uganda is that the Israelis had built that airport and had trained that army. It was no achievement to get in there and knock out that airport and so-called rescue these people who wasn't that much captive in the first place. But when someone else makes your roads, train your army, they have control of the mentality of your army. Your army is less valuable to you because you did not train it and you did not indoctrinate it. I'm talking about something that has to be universal and has to relate to the totality of our history. And we have to understand how history, as I've said before, is still a clock that people use to tell that time of day. It is a compass that people use to locate themselves on the map of human geography. When we bring about the total revolution that will be the ultimate unity of all of our people through a Pan-African concept, we stop talking about, we can take pride in what island we came from without making a cult out of it, and we can take pride in being a Georgian. I often speak of myself as being a Georgian and an Alabamian. Not so much with pride, but the fact that I survived both of them. I survived 2 hells and 2 frying pans. I got double strength to live through that. And returning to the South, I saw the same thing, a spirit there that I didn't find other places. When I'm talking about that we can be different, and yet, while being different, we're all the same people with the same destiny. And Marcus Garvey said, one aim, one God, one destination. And that is truth. But what we have to understand, no matter what we plan to be, no matter where we are in life and who we relate to, that you began by checking out history, where you've been, where you are, in order to understand where you still have to go. I maintain that the first step in liberation is self-discovery, and that history, in the final analysis, is the same as the relationship of a child to his mother's breast. Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of minutes. We're actually going to stay here.
I'll walk downstairs and I'll come right back up.
Dr. John Henrik Clarke. I don't think I'm wrong, far off in my analysis when I say he's the Charlie Parker of the lecturers or the historians. For those of you young people, first of all, I'm very happy to see that each week we seem to be growing in our younger people coming to these lectures. And I'm very happy to see that. And I said that to say those of you younger people who doesn't know who Charlie Parker is, or that fact, the elder people who don't know who Charlie Parker is, I suggest that you do some research on that aspect of our music, because like everything else, we have allowed the European to steal that also and to distort it. I am very happy that Dr. Clarke has become a permanent part of our lecture series. He's been coming here for many, many years. And hopefully in September, we'll be able to duplicate that 10-week series we did in '87. I know that would thrill my heart, and I know that would really thrill your heart. While Dr. Clarke is taking a break, and he's going to come back and answer a question and answer period. And when that period comes, I'm going to ask again, and I'm going to insist again, that you ask the question, and please do not have your own lecture, which many of us tend to do, which sometimes is good because some of us have the information that we need, that other people need, but we have to remember that Dr. Clarke works very hard, travels a lot, is up studying, and if you notice he sits here, once in a while he has a piece of paper in his hand, but everything he says is coming from that automatic tape recorder or record that he has, which is fantastic and it's a God-given gift. But also we ask here at the House of the Lord Church that when we come to these lectures, and I often know as many of us come to these lectures and we buy the tapes and we listen, but we do not share that information. And I believe that we have to share this. Often we say other people don't want to hear this. But I'm telling you from what I know from fact, if you talk it around your job and in your community, sooner or later, somebody's going to start listening to you. And sooner or later, they'll come to these lectures, and sooner or later, you'll find more unity within your community and within where you live at or on your job, and you can find something else to talk about besides, how much money Michael Jordan is making, and et cetera, and who won the game between the Lakers and so forth. That's interesting also, but we need to talk about other things than sports and how much money that Michael Spinks and them did for that 91 minutes. 91 seconds, yeah, well, it should have been 91 minutes for $40. I would have been mad. But anyway, that's where all that is at, and Dr. Clarke will be back in a minute. Brothers and sisters, I have been given instruction by one of the head ladies of this church, who's been the backbone of the church many years, and she's right. She's asked me to say to you that when you finish with your plates or your cups or your napkins or whatever, please do not leave it on your seat, or please do not deposit it on the floor. We have a wastebasket in the back. Please put it in the wastebasket. If not, just take it to one of the back tables and put it there. We'll pick it up from there. I thank you. I want to remind you of the July 13th date 7 p.m., when we're going to have a racial injustice community forum, the emphasis on the Tawana Brawley case. I also wanted to, somebody told me last week of the sister that had the video store in Queens, and I forgot the location. I wrote it down. Does anyone know that has the video store in Queens that has the positive? Do you know the exact address? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Linden Boulevard and 199th Street in Queens, and there's another. I have yet to find the name of the store on 125th Street as also. These are stores that selling positive videos, and they have. I think that I'm quite sure they have tapes of Dr. Clarke, Dr. Ben, etc., etc. I would suggest that you buy those and take them home and let your family or your children share them with you. Also, there's a brother in the audience. His name is Milton Gills. Where are you, brother? Right here. Stand. He has an African artisans company on 169 Baldwin Road in Hempstead, New York. And those of you in that area or live in that area, spread the word about this. But we need to support our own brothers who want to have their own businesses so that we can grow economically, and this brother can grow economically. I'm quite sure he's put a lot into this business, and he needs all the support we can get, that he can get. Also, I want to make an announcement that the Pentecostal churches has a basketball league, and the House of the Lord Church just won the playoff game, and we're going to be playing in the championship on July 9th, it's a Saturday, 1988 at 3 p.m. at the Salvation Army. It's 110 Kosciuszko Street. I believe that's Kosciuszko and Bedford, I'm not sure. And the admission is $5. And I know you've all heard Reverend Doherty speak, and you've seen him lead the marches, but I don't know how many of you have ever seen him play basketball. And he plays. No doubt about it, he plays. So the House of the Lord is in the championship. We invite you to come out. And this is another way of sharing and getting together, because we believe that those of us that play together, a family that plays together, stays together, and we need to do more recreational things on that behalf. I will bring Dr. Clarke back for our answering question period. We're going to go for about 15 to 20 minutes, and please, if you have a question, raise your hand. I will recognize you and ask your question to Dr. Clarke, and Dr. Clarke will answer you promptly. I thank you. If you have any questions, just raise your hand where you are. Brother right here.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you ever heard of a concept called Hallelujah. It's supposed to be something to do with culture. We believe that they're lacking and that we need to move forward with and make this happen in reality. And I wanted to know what you thought of that concept and what you think is relative, or what you think another approach to culture could be implemented.
It is one of many approaches to African culture. It is as valid as other approaches. I think some wrong things have been done with it, and some wrong people have attached themselves to it. And I think sometimes Qaeda becomes a cultural cult and a hustle, like all forms of nationalism, in the wrong hands. It's nothing new. It was started by Melina Karinga and was picked up by Leroy Jones, who became Amir Baraka. I think a concept, it depends on what's done with it. I mean, when I look at the concept of nationalism, which I've always been, and right now I deplore the fact that many people are using nationalism to hide their Marxism. I have nothing against people being Marxists. If you're going to be a Marxist, go ahead and be one, but don't get nationalism mixed up with it, because the Marxists are traditionally anti-nationalists. I think Qaeda was a tension. It's an aspect of of reclamation of African culture. The whole concept of Kwanzaa came out of the Kahira theory, and I thought that was very good. I think that needs to be taken even further. I think we need to Africanize every holiday, Africanize Thanksgiving, because we had nothing to do with those people killing those Indians and living through the winter, using techniques that the Indians had taught them, and turning against the Indians who had taught. We had nothing to do with all of that. And we're memorializing things. We don't know who we memorialize it, sometimes except our own murderers. Why can't we have a Memorial Day and memorialize our heroes? Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gordon, and Captain Kojo, and why can't we just memorialize it? Well, you don't have to memorialize me. I don't plan to go. I might go tomorrow, but I got planned to just to live forever. Later for memorializing me. Just make sure that I stay healthy enough to do the work for the people that I'm supposed to do. No. We need more talk on how different things are used now, and we can't just fall for everything because it has an African name, an art-sounding name. Make sure that there's a legitimacy behind it, and not just another hustle in the name of Africa.
Dr. Clarke, I'd like to ask a question. Given that we need to have an African world revolution, and given also that Europeans are not going to stand idly by while we try to take their power away, can you speak to the fact that there are going to be people that get killed? And also, can you also speak to the fact that the majority of Africans in the world fear Europeans? And also, can you, tell me why should we, let Europeans live in peace and harmony when we don't have it ourselves?
Well, while most of the Africans in the world have been under some form of European dominance, I think he feels more than anything else European weaponry, because he's proven that he's just as much of a man as a European. Well, I think once we free ourselves from European dominance and free our mind more than anything else from European dominance, European concept, we begin to develop concepts of our own. We will not care much about whether the European lives in peace. He's not going to live in peace like the Europeans in South Africa wouldn't be living in peace, because I don't advocate no unity between black and white in South Africa. And I don't advocate no sharing of power. I advocate that those Europeans who love Africa so much that they don't want to leave, let's accommodate them. Let's give them a piece of Africa that they can keep forever, the length of their body from head to toe, 6 feet under the ground. In a revolution, most of the things in the revolution that I'm talking about can be done without murder and without killing. And yet, if you rule out the fact that some people are going to be killed, then you really will have no revolution at all. Because no one is going to give up the massive power of controlling this world until you draw some blood. And some will have to go, and I might be one of them. And I don't know anybody else who brought off a revolution that didn't kill somebody. No, there's revolutions are going on all of the time. And all revolutions do not necessarily relate to killing people. But there's an aspect of revolution that must. Now, I don't think there's any peaceful way of liberating the people in Southern Africa. And I think a combined African army must march on to South Africa. There must be an internal army and an external army. I mean, one inside and one coming from outside. And they can't separate who was good and who was not, who was liberal and who was not. If you're in his way, you're supposed to be destroyed. Now, I don't talk about one man, one vote in Africa. I don't talk about majority rule. I talk about African power. Let the African come to power and begin to make decisions. No sizable white people are going to ever live in peace under non-white rule. So he's going to go one way or the other. Once Africa truly comes to power, if Africa comes to power and leave the white apparatus intact, he is not in power. Many African states have white secretaries of the treasury, white head of the army. There was a white general, the head of Ghanaian's army, why they didn't rescue Lumumba. I'm not talking about, don't go halfway. You either got a revolution or you haven't got one. And a revolution is not a reform movement. And they're going to have to be an African world revolution. Relate to the African people of the world. The untouchable Indians, I'm not untouchable anymore. You think I'm untouchable, I'm going to touch you and break your neck at the same time. Just like after Martin Luther King made a speech, his famous I Got a Dream speech, someone circulated a speech they called by Bo Diddler's plan, Bo Diddler's dream. I mean, that means Bo Diddler is a common word for common ordinary, pool playing, loud talking, razor blade switch. But the one thing about Bo, he can fight. He's got a lot of raw energy. Then in one of the poem written about Bo, reaction to King's I Got a Dream speech, he said that I'm going to be a man in this old town, I'll burn the MF down. Now, Du Bois discovered during the Atlanta riot of 1906 that there was an energy in the common man that made him respected. Because the whites had turned out the lights, they had turned off the water, the black community closed the stores. Bo Diddler and his crowd had opened up the stores, was giving out the food, women and children first, with their bare feet, with no spikes. They climbed up the poles until they found the right lever to get the lights back on. They go into enough manholes and got the right wheel to turn to get the water back on. Well, the middle class black was trying to get across town to ask their good white folks to stop the riot. Du Bois didn't get across town, but he went through a black neighborhood where the common ordinary black had shown himself to be the true revolutionist. He had done what had to be done. Open the stores again, turn on the lights again, turn the water again. And he wasn't crying about what's going to happen. What's going to happen when the white folks come? He had no time to think about that. He just did what he had to do. I'm saying that many times our revolution is going to come from some strange places. It may come from, might be a lot of winos in there doing some good job. the atmosphere of a revolution will change a whole lot of people. A whole lot of people will think twice. What's am I dousing my body with all this alcohol? You gonna straighten up. Am I feeding poison in my veins? But we have to start the revolution. I think we have to start it with ourselves. And I guess I'm a poor person to be preaching, but every time I preach a sermon, I remember that I'm preaching something which I haven't fully practiced myself. But I do as best I can, and I'm always working on me. I don't think I'm anything close to being perfect. That's why I'm always working on me. Because if I can bring myself in line, I think that I can help to bring a few other people in line. That was another question.
Can we get a list of all the names that you had mentioned in the books and so forth, information list?
Oh, given time, I have furnished several good lists to the different conveners of these series. When I did the African series, I furnished a good list. When I did the African American series, but I think I can, given a little more time, maybe sometime in July, you really should know something about the political literature of Africa. The books I mentioned on Ghana and Nigeria, the books Africans written about African liberation. We need just to concentrate on what did the Africans say about all of this. And throughout Africa, there's a body of good literature written by Africans. It's well worth considering. I reread Saul Platjay's The Native Problem in Africa. It was written as almost as a letter to the British Labour Party, explaining how the British betrayed the Africans, but also telling the British that they betrayed you too, and that the British laborer is also betrayed. He isn't making no money. While he gets this whole little towns furnishing goods and service to Africa, but second-rate bric-a-brac and junk, but your life is not so rosy. So the British upper class, the capitalists, the imperialists, he exploits everybody, and he'll exploit you too. And that's what he has done in order to be rich. He exploited the British too. And Platjay's work it's in paperback now, so it's easy to get. Is a good explanation as to how both classes are exploited in imperialism, not just the African. Among the Southern African writers, and also there's a body of literature, of history work written by South Africans, especially Thomas Mafolo, who wrote an excellent history of Chaka and historical romance, and Bantu's past and present. There's a lot of good African history written by Africans. And there's a large body of African literature in Southern Africa. But the best political literature in all Africa was written in West Africa, mainly Ghana. Nigeria is second. And among the countries in Africa where the African teachers write the history books, the leading countries, Ghana and Nigeria. Nigeria leads in writing history books. Ghanaians lead in writing political books. Africans have said some remarkable things about themselves and laid out some remarkable plans for their own redemption. And the Black Americans have done the same thing. And the Caribbeans have done the same thing, principally. The Jamaicans, mainly because Jamaica is large, and Jamaica has produced a larger number of political thinkers. Books coming from Jamaica on the subject. If you ever Jamaica, in Kingston, go to Sandstrom's bookstore. There are two bookstores. I know what the first one, the main one is near the waterfront, but the other one is close to Old Hope Road, going up to Papad Market. But if you find one, you'll find the other one. You find a lot of good basic histories of the West Indies written by local people. And they are gradually turning away from that colonial interpretation to an indigenous interpretation of their own. I mean, they're slow on what we call Afrocentricity, but they're on the move, they're on the way. But the best Caribbean writers are in the United States. Orlando Patterson, the sociologist of slavery, was a landmark work in the subject, and his Slavery and Social Death is another, is his way of looking at slavery in a total way as against that affecting the Africans. But I tell you what I will try to do and leave here at the church for someone else to reproduce. I will do a good basic list on African political literature that you need to know about. If my health holds up, I will be associated. I will with the church in the lecture series as needed. You know, beginning in the fall. I don't know what specifically, but I will be doing. But the brothers will work it out, and they'll contact me. You know, I've had invitation to go to many places and many churches because this is the only church that I have associated myself with in for such a length of time, such a long series, mainly because it's a church of action. It's an action church. It's a church where a whole lot of things going on other than praying. I ain't got nothing against praying. But there's so many things going on here other than praying. So I think you watch as well as pray. And that's good. I think your watching is good and your praying is good.